the job of film scoring is it's pretty hard. Firstly, just emotionally, when it comes to writing emotions, you have to be able to conjure any emotion and any degree of emotion, which is hard. So you might write a really nice piece of music, but let's say someone says, we changed our minds. We don't think that in these 2 seconds we really don't want sadness. We want melancholy. And then at the snap of a finger, you have to change that.
Hi, you're listening to Conversations with Musicians with Leah Roseman. Colin Aguiar is an award-winning Indian-Canadian composer based in Los Angeles who specializes in film scoring. In this conversation, we talked about his youth, growing up across parts of India, the Middle East, Europe, and Canada, and studying the music of various cultures, learning different instruments with a start on drums as a toddler, as well as his love for the music of Arvo Pärt and other great composers. Colin spoke about some of his mentors, including Mychael Danna. This episode with Colin is the first release of several film composers I've interviewed recently, and I find it fascinating how diverse their musical backgrounds are and what a challenging and little understood part of the music world this is. During the episode, you'll hear some clips from Colin's compositions used with permission. Like all my episodes, this is available on your favorite podcast player, as well as a video, and the transcript is linked as well to my website, leahroseman.com. Colin Aguiar, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Leah. I'm really honored to be on this podcast. I've listened to some of your interviews and I love them. Big fan.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I was just saying to you before we started recording that I will be interviewing a few film and television composers, but you're absolutely the first, and it's really great that we can talk about a very unique corner of the music world, I would say.
I guess so, yeah. There's many corners, and I guess this is one of them. It's not unique to me. It's I wake up to it every day, so.
Well, I don't always like to start with people's childhoods, but I think in your case you had such an interesting upbringing musically. If we could just start to talk about your background and your family and the encouragement and inspiration you got from your dad.
Yeah, so my dad was a pop singer, and he as being in a band for so many years, you pick up instruments and you start to play them, guitars, drums, whatever it happens to be, and so he was familiar with the drums, and so when I came around, I guess it was their idea to get this toy drum set and see if just as a toy. And for some reason, they noticed, that I was taking to it or something. I don't have a perfect recollection of what happened when I was like 2, but apparently I was taking to it really well, and they started noticing, and it got to the point where they said, should we get him a real drum set? And so they got me a real drum set when I was 4, and we still have it today. I love that drum set a lot. It's I just started. I guess I had natural rhythm back then. Not anymore. It's strange. I can't dance, but I have natural rhythm. I assure you.
That's funny you say you can't dance, because I
don't dance. I refuse to dance.
Yeah,
that's what it is.
Most musicians I know don't dance at parties. It's not a thing.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're like extra self-conscious about rhythm or something, but it's kind of interesting, actually.
And I've been around ballet dancers. I know what it's supposed to look like. I'm not graceful, so I just stay out of that lane. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you were 4, when you had a full-size drum set, how did that even work?
You mean as in reaching for things?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's hard to explain, but yeah, we had a stool. We still have the same stool, mm-hmm. and what's called drum throne, I guess. It was lower to the lowest level, and the snare was lower to the lowest level, and the hi-hat was lower to the lowest level, and everything was lower to the lowest level. I'd also do these sets, like my parents would get invited to a lot of weddings, and so they'd invite me on stage to do a set with a band, or so 5 or 6 or 7, and they'd lower everything so that I could do a set, and but the thing is, the size of due to the size of a drum set, I'd always the tom toms would be like this, and no one would really see me. I'd stare at people dancing through the tom toms, but no one would really see me playing. So they'd just see sticks flying once in a while.
So your uncle was in the band along with your dad?
Yeah, my uncle was in the band that my dad had. Um, yeah, and that's how I guess he met my mom. So they it was all in the band, I guess.
And your parents, maybe we can talk about their immigration story because it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, so my parents are from India originally, and so I guess there are a section of Indian people. It's pretty popular that people go outside of India and primarily, they'll earn a living and send money back to their families. But and that's how I think it started for both parents individually. But they started to really enjoy the life outside of India, and I guess they just stayed. We went from they went from India to Kuwait. They met in Kuwait, and then we went to we still go back and forth to India like every year. Um, we immigrated to Canada, but before that, we do these stints. We do like summers and stuff in either England or Amsterdam, and then to Canada, and then eventually I went to the States to LA. So
Hmm.
yeah, it's very. Oh yeah, I also studied in India for a period of time. I did some college there, and I did some high school there as well. And I had a lot of school changes. I had like 9 high school changes internationally.
Wow.
So yeah, and it's you, as a kid you question it a lot because it's like everyone else gets to play with other kids in the summer, and it's like why me? Like why do I have to leave? Um, but that question is answered now, because in my work there does tend to arise the question of pulling off ethnic music authentically, and I find that yeah, all that time I was just accumulating these this kind of like degree in ethnomusicology because you get to ethnic music is full of nuances, and I was lucky enough to kind of um, experience these nuances firsthand.
So the part of India that your parents are from, Goa, is more like Western music influenced.
India is by far one of the most diverse populations. Even though we were in a part of the population, a minority part of the population that was populated by Catholics, you partake in Hindu celebrations, you partake in Hindi language movies, you partake in um, Muslim celebrations as well, and so Bollywood was a part of that. It was just a part of. It wasn't it wasn't far removed by any chance. It was really part of the vernacular. Bollywood movies just kind of enter your everyday on a minute to minute basis. So
Hmm.
yeah, Bollywood movies, and at home it was a lot of classical training. But yeah, both of those things together.
Hmm.
And when we lived in the Middle East, it was a lot of Arabic tradition as well. So all of that was spinning at the same time.
I thought this would be an interesting point for the listeners to hear some of your music, and I thought we could play the clip from the movie Fly about an immigration story in which you incorporate Indian sounds with Irish sounds. So if you could talk to that clip that people are going to hear, that would be really good.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Fly was a really, really important movie for me. It was one of the first ones I did. It was a short film. It was so good. It went to the Toronto International Film Festival, and was recognized by a lot of critics to also have garnered critical attention. The reason why that movie was important is because it explored immigration or the displacement of immigrants in a foreign country in a really poetic way. There was hardly any dialogue in that movie, and so a lot of responsibility fell on the music. The music kind of explained and verified facial expressions or the mood of the scene, and it really was a pretty big driver in defining the narration of that movie for the audience. And so musically, it became the question of how are we going to express that since it has such a large voice. And we went through a number of ideas with the director, who I'm still friends with. We're still very close friends because that experience was so bonding, I would say. But in that journey, what we discovered worked best would be a an Indian ensemble. Well, sorry, I should preface by saying the story is about a boy in an Indian family, and the boy it doesn't explicitly say this, but the boy is pretty much intrinsically Canadian. His way of thinking, the way his brain is wired, is Canadian, and in a way, symbolically, is different from his parents. And so to have that symbolic transition to the music, what it turned out to be was an Indian ensemble with a couple Celtic instruments in the center of it. So the Celtic instruments would hold melody and would be the harmonic support would be handled by the Indian ensemble. And it was a very almost like a mirror effect in the ensemble, as in both ensembles, the acting ensemble and the musical ensemble. And yeah, it kind of worked. It also I should say that both both cultures, the Irish culture, which is one of the originating cultures in Canada, and Indian music have this pentatonic scale or not entirely pentatonic, but there are some harmonies that overlap, and in that way, there is this overlap between the son and the parents, and so it just was a really really great way to mirror what was happening on screen.
Thanks so much for sharing that.
Thanks, Leah.
That's great. Another thing that might be good to talk about now is Torn from Her Arms.
Okay.
Because that, in terms of the migration story, so that is very different music.
What this movie is about is family separation. A few years ago, when migrant families would arrive at the U.S. border, children were separated from their parents, and then through a breakdown of the system, were never reunited. And this traces the story of one mother-daughter family that were reunited, but through a lot of pain and a lot of fighting the system. And so this movie, it's got an orchestral score in the first place, but the language of the orchestral score is mainly very, it was inspired by one of my favorite composers, Arvo Pärt, this Estonian composer, who bases a lot of his work on scripture and on his adoration of his Christian faith. He's very dedicated to his Christian faith. And the symbolism here is that there are things in the Christian Catholic faith that apply to the treatment of people. Do unto others like you would have being done unto you. And so there was this really great overlap in philosophy that needed to be imparted on the story, and rightly so, because the audience is also very Judeo-Christian. And
So I didn't have a chance to see this movie. So is the whole score similar to this string writing, or is this just part of it?
yeah, the whole score is similar to it. So it's done in the rules set forth by Arvo Pärt for his harmonic structure.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. And I'm curious about the use of synthesizers, and I know that sometimes you'll have an opportunity to score for live musicians, and sometimes you'll be using synthesized sounds depending on the project. Synthesized sounds have come a long way, right, in terms of the quality of the samples. So what is your experience of that in your time in the industry? Is it already changed, or?
Synthesize. Well, I guess when you enter this topic, there are two. There's two groups of synthesized sound, you could say. One is synthesized sound that is concerned just with synthesizers and electronic music and things that do not sound orchestral. Mm-hmm. And then there's a group of synthesis where the aim is to produce something orchestral. And so, the thing with this job is that technology is something you just can't escape. It's a very important factor. And if there wasn't there was a time when I wasn't that good at synthesis, or electronic synthesis, and you just kind of learn it. If you don't have something, you just kind of try to acquire that knowledge. So yeah, you can't really pass go without absorbing it.
And before we leave it, in the music from The Fly, the first excerpt we played, so was that all written out? Like, were you working with musicians who are all music readers, or do sometimes people learn by ear for scores? You know what I mean?
That's a good question. When I recorded all the Celtic stuff, it was mostly alien pipes. Actually, you know what? It was done quite a while ago, so I'm trying to recollect everything that I did for that score. So basically, it's alien pipes and all this Indian stuff around it. And the alien pipes, I remember, I showed the session player the music, but it was way better to just do it by ear. Mm-hmm. He just found himself to be a lot more untethered, mm-hmm. and his performances were just better without reading anything. So some musicians really love something extremely specific. Those are probably musicians that are trained to read and have a certain expectation in their part that directs every nuance of what they do, and other people, it's a discussion. So yeah, it depends.
Yeah, I was just curious about that. And this other clip, this beautiful variation you did on the El Salvadorian national anthem, also relates. It's not from the same movie of the Torn From Her Arms. It's a separate.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I went and listened to the original anthem, of course, and heard how martial it was, and it was very interesting to hear that contrast. Yeah. So what inspired you to write this?
It was also inspired by these immigrants that were coming, or migrants that were coming to the border, and the thing about I would think maybe it fluctuates from country to country, but most people, I think, would have a pride in where they come from, and even if you don't have such a resounding pride in where you come from, at least there are things about where you grow up and where you live that you tend to love and get used to, and relationships you build. And when someone leaves their country to go somewhere else, they're also leaving behind all those things that they love and that they're used to in their routine. And human beings don't always love change. They don't wake up every day looking for change. So it was inspired by the fact that a lot of these people have to mourn a lot of what they grew up with, and that's why that piece of music, unlike the original, is more of a lament. It's more of a mournful take on the original anthem. It's more of, it says, I'm missing you, as opposed to something else that's emoted in the anthem.
Did you write the lyrics for that?
No, I borrowed that from the actual anthem as well, and it was performed by an El Salvadorian singer as well.
Yeah, beautiful singing.
Yeah, thank you. She's amazing.
So maybe we could go back now. So we started talking
Yeah.
about a little bit about your upbringing. I remember you had told me previously you had a very influential percussion teacher, drum teacher, who exposed you to lots of cultures through music and you worked with for a long time.
Yeah, so this guy was a friend of my dad's who was another drummer on the scene, although a very, very good drummer. And he didn't purposely expose me to all these different cultures. But, the thing is, while learning a number of other instruments, um, drums drum set just happens to be an instrument where the what you learn if you go the jazz route is you learn rhythms, and all these rhythms come from different parts of the world. So when my teacher was telling me about these things, he'd tell me the origins or something like the begin or the rumba or the cha 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 or the tango, and where these things come from, or Afro-Cuban rhythms, or rhythms from Havana and stuff. So, you know, um, and if you really look at it, each one of these beats or rhythms that I mentioned have a huge history. There's a huge cultural process that might have taken decades, if not centuries, to evolve to. They all have other rhythms that they come from. They have the influence of other cultures sometimes. So it's a combination of things. There's always, or in most cases, there's always a dance that comes with it, you know, and and just as a lot of these rhythms have grooves, which are not always on the beat, which are just sometimes a microsecond behind the beat or in front of the beat, those things, even though I'm putting them technically, all translate into gestures and mannerisms from the cultures that they come from. And those mannerisms are in the attitude that people exercise their daily life in those countries or in those parts of the world. And so you can't help but think that, if I want to get this Argentinian rhythm correctly, maybe, I should know a little bit about the people in Argentina and where, why this beat is the way it is. And so when you explore these things in maybe Northern Africa or Central Africa or South America or whatever you're trying to study and break down, you'll eventually understand, or begin to understand some of these cultures and scratch the surface. So learning drums just so happens to kind of be like a real nice little world tour of the world in a way that studying doing violin etudes or playing the guitar or learning Bach on the piano won't really exercise that muscle. It's the one instrument that will take you on that tour.
Mm-hmm. As we are recording this now, you haven't heard my episode with jazz drummer Micah Sudri, but it will be released soon. So it's all jazz drum set episode, and we talk about a lot of the stuff, and he plays a lot.
Did he say anything similar? Did he?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. People will listen to that. Anyway, for anyone interested in this topic, I'll just point them to that episode. Hi, just a quick break from the episode. I'm an independent podcaster who does all the many jobs required to produce this series, and there are a lot of costs I bear as well. Please consider either buying me a virtual coffee as a tip or becoming a monthly supporter starting at $3 Canadian, which is close to $2 US or €2, and getting access to unique perks. The link is in the description. Now back to the episode. Yeah, so this, I know you were really invested as a percussion, as a drummer, but you also played other instruments. But how much were you putting into drumming when you were a kid? Like how many hours or how many years?
Yeah, this is I would put in like it was like instituted at home like 5 hours a day.
What?
Yeah, like 2.5 hours. It would be normal if I couldn't do 5 hours a day, but basically it was 5 hours a day. I don't really have much of a life outside of music, really.
But your parents expected you to play drums that much, or you just got into that routine?
Oh no, they both. I mean, if I didn't put in 5 hours a day, they'd be like, why haven't you put in 5 hours a day? Sometimes it would be split up. Sometimes it wouldn't always be 5 hours at a stretch. It'd be like 2 hours, 2 hours, 2 hours, or something like that. But yeah, 5 hours a day.
Why do you think they were putting pressure for that much time? Were they worried about your success as a musician, that you needed to be at the top of your game, or?
No, in the end, they don't really want me to be a musician, but I don't know. I have no idea. That's a good question. That I don't know. I don't know to what end game that would have served them, but I don't know. I guess maybe they wanted me to be good at something. And yeah, it's the only thing I'm good at, so that explains it. But it's not like I hated it. I enjoyed it as well. So
When I know you played some other instruments, when did you find time to do that?
that was introduced well, not along the same time, but as I grew up, there were just more instruments added, mostly piano and guitar, and then violin on my own. And yeah, it was part of practice. And but by the time piano and guitar was introduced, I had already had this proficiency at drums, so I could split my 5 hours into 2 hours in drums and 3 hours on everything else. So yeah, depending on what I needed to better at, I would just kind of spend more time there.
And you started composing when you were fairly young as well.
Yeah, yeah. I was like 10. I was doing
So
arrangements and stuff. Yeah.
So arrangements of songs you were hearing, or what kind of?
Yeah, I would. The thing is that I found my piano lessons to be so boring, and so I'd be like, I'd go to my teacher and I'd say, hey, could we do this pop song or something? And she'd say, well, if you can find the sheet music for it. And I couldn't find the sheet music for it, so I'd write the sheet music for it, and that's kind of how a lot of arrangements started. But then I would write the sheet music for a pop song in like a Latin rhythm because of drums. And so that's how these arrangements would get started. Mm-hmm. And then offshoot into composition and stuff.
And when you were in high school, you'd started to write full-length musical theaters pieces for fun.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't for fun. It was more like I got really serious about it, and I just enjoyed it. I really loved musical theater. So yeah, it was something I really did with a huge passion.
What I meant when I said for fun, Colin, I didn't mean to put it down. I meant you weren't being asked to write something for a specific performance. It was.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, no, I do it in the summers. And no one asked me to do it. I did it because this is something I wanted to do. Possibly, I was thinking about it after high school, so it became something that became a priority for me.
Mm-hmm. For those people listening to the podcast, it'd be nice to describe what I'm seeing here, and they can see the video later. Sure. You have 3 enormous screens behind you with your keyboard. Mm-hmm. Maybe you could talk about your gear and the necessary setup to do this kind of work.
Sure. Every composer is different. Every composer has a unique studio. For the most part, it's kind of the same. The reason I have screens is because I personally believe that the eye is faster than the hand, than the arms, and so if I can see things, if a number of windows are open and my eyes can dart from one screen to the next, It's much faster than my hands can do that, especially when you're using a mouse. And a mouse is, if you really look at it in the real world, if you're cooking with just one finger, it's going to take a long time. But you have five fingers and two hands and two eyes, and so you that's why cooking is so much faster than moving a mouse. So the philosophy of the screens is to be able to maximize what I can see, so I can move fast.
I was wondering what you would have up on the separate screens then when you're working.
Yeah. Oh, what's on the separate screens?
Mm-hmm.
I use a program called Logic Pro. It's made by the Apple company, and they have something called the arrange page, or basically the work page, where most of the work is done. I have that on my main screen. On the screen above, I usually have the film playing, and on the two side screens, I usually have all my tools. The tools that enable me to see the length of notes, or what it would look like on a printed manuscript, or allow me to affect the mix of the music, as in if let's say the brass is now playing the melody and needs to sound higher than the string section, and then if they recede into the harmony, they need to recede into the mix. So those are things that I'll manipulate on another screen. But these are all things that have to happen at the same time. As you can tell, each of all these things that I mentioned happen, continually change on a second to second basis, and they continually need to be manipulated on a second to second basis. And so I need to kind of manage these fluctuations from second to second, and that's why I need to have them all in iShot.
Mm-hmm. So this short film, your score was widely acclaimed for. Do you pronounce it construct or construct?
Whichever one. No one's
Okay.
No one's really. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I did watch it. Interesting use of
Thank
the technology, but certainly the music made the film, in my opinion.
So
So we can so we can play the clip you've selected. This dubstep is used with this orchestral score.
I'd always been a fan of dubstep music. I go to dubstep concerts. I really admire the genre. It's a different discipline of synthesis that is very unique, and is very admirable. All the things that they do in this genre. When this movie came along, it wasn't very hard to see that dubstep actually does sound like robots talking, and so it was again this really beautiful overlap.
Okay. Well, thanks for that clip.
Oh,
And
thank you.
yeah, maybe we could talk about one of your mentors, Mychael Danna, and how he helped you
Mhm.
in the profession.
Yeah, Mychael. I've known Mychael for a long time. Yeah, I would say Mychael. In the beginning, he just was really nice, and he called me over to his place once when I for after I talked to him on the first time, and he said, maybe you can play me some of your music, and I played him my music, and I didn't really know, how much he would appreciate this, but in hindsight, I played him some Arab music that I'd written. I played him some Indian music, and I didn't know how much of a ethno music buff he was, but I think that immediately set some giant overlap between our two skill sets, and of course the orchestral stuff. So yeah, it was definitely just two people that had common interests, that had a lot of fun listening to the same music together.
So you had assisted him on Life of Pi, was one of the first projects?
No, the first project we that came through the studio was the tail end of an Ang Lee movie called The Ice Storm, and then was The Sweet Hereafter, and then came a movie that not too many people know about. It's called Regeneration, or they might have changed the title. It's a really beautiful World War I movie. And yeah, so it was a few projects between then and Life of Pi. And so that was when we both lived in Toronto. And then he moved to LA, and then I moved to LA, and then we did Life of Pi. Yeah.
Okay. And so, in terms of your apprenticeship in the business and learning about all the different jobs in as a role of composer, maybe you could talk to some of that, like your opportunity to write filler and how you're able to learn from a master like Mychael and so on.
Yeah, I've worked for actually 6 different composers. And I would say the thing about film music is that everyone, firstly, I mean, most people think of music as being very simple, and they think of film music as being even simpler than, popular music. But in fact, the job of film scoring is it's pretty hard, mainly because what you're doing is, firstly, just emotionally, when it comes to writing emotions, you have to be able to conjure any emotion and any degree of emotion, which is hard. So if you have jealousy, how do you happy and sad is pretty black and white, but how do you emote jealousy or envy, or how do you what are the different ranges of happiness, melancholy, and you might write a really nice piece of music, but let's say someone says, we changed our minds. We don't think that in these 2 seconds we really don't want sadness. We want melancholy. And then at the snap of a finger, you have to change that. Like changing things on a dime is what makes film composition, which has to be done on a schedule, different from music that has the luxury of no deadline or very distant deadlines. But in addition to that, is the fact that that's a very technological field, and the technology over the years from when I trained with these 6 composers has changed. You used to have racks and racks of synthesizers and tape machines, and now you have a single computer, or you have a Pro Tools machine. And so these things, and also there's the thing of your endurance or your work ethic, which is very different from any other field, whether in music or not. The mentality of always being in service of your team and working with a team. All of these things are things that doesn't really occur to you when you think of film music, but these are things that I acquired from working with all these people that I still carry today. And I think it can't be undersold, because it kind of I use these tools every second of every day.
And when you say these tools, you mean what you're just talking about, the technology, or you mean personal tools to be able to transmit emotion? It's very specific emotions in music.
Yeah, both. The like for example, the you know, my impression was that for a piece of classical music, if you're writing a symphony or something, you do have a deadline, but you might have like I don't know, like months or a year to do 15, 20 minutes of music. But over here, in film music, you might have to do like 85 minutes of music in 3 weeks. So, what does your body go through? If you're not really, if you have to work, um, a ton of hours, what is your, what is your frame of thought? How do you always remain receptive to changes on a team, or your outlook to working hard is not the same as when you have the luxury of time. I would say that these are some invaluable things that are passed on, I think, in these apprenticeships. It's not a typical job, so you need someone to tell you what typical is, and it's far from um, a common day understanding of typical.
So was it a shock for you when you started working in the business, just how hard you had to work, how many hours you had to put in?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I worked for an amazing composer. Natale was the first composer I ever worked for. Most people won't know Lou, but Lou was a Canadian composer. He was originally American, and he worked his ass off. We were doing commercials, and we'd work till like sometimes 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. And I was young at the time, and Lou would, and I remember working at 4 o'clock in the morning, and and we still had ways to go before the presentation to the ad agency. And I would say, Lou, it's 4 o'clock in the morning, and he'd say, "Oh, Colin, that really does suck. Hey, you know what you should do? You should just go out and like walk around the block and come back." And I was amazed he said that, because typically at any job you don't work at 4 o'clock in the morning. But that is exactly what you have to do when you're on a deadline. Just walk it off and come back and make your deadline.
Yeah. Do you think the discipline you learned as a young person practicing that many hours, it must have helped you in terms of that aspect?
Yeah, you're very right. There is that carry forwarding of that attitude. The one thing I think of a lot uh, is the kind of sacrifice, because and social sacrifice. All the time I was uh, practicing as a musician, as a kid growing up, it would be with other kids playing in the background outside my home,
Mm.
and I never got to do that. And now, there'll be fireworks going off for New Year's, or whatever it is, or there'll be some cars honking because a team won or something like that. I don't get to partake in that, or I don't get holidays or 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 weekends off or anything like that. So yeah, it is a pleasure to do this job, but it sometimes the way the world turns, kind of, and all the celebrations that keep happening are sometimes in your face, and it's good to have the practice of being immune to that kind of stuff.
Do you miss playing music, having the opportunity just to jam?
Once in a while, but I'd say my satisfaction, my spiritual satisfaction, comes from writing music. So so I find it kind of fulfilling. Yeah.
Yeah. It might be interesting to share. You wrote a palindrome, but it said palindrome 9 on the clip. So is this? Did you write many of them, or was it just the name of?
Yeah, growing up, I would write palindromes,
Okay.
just for the fun of it, just for the exercise.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, this one palindrome I wrote for Construct, and this one has the added difficulty of not just being played backwards the same, but I reversed the audio. So once the whole thing is recorded, played forward and backwards on paper, then the whole audio is reversed. And so if you take the full piece on a whole and reverse it, it'll sound exactly the same.
So Colin, when you say good values, you mean more complex or like more artistic?
Well, what I mean by that is that they have found better ways to build a building for it not to collapse,
Mm-hmm.
or the stairs have given ways to escalators and elevators. There's better ways of doing things in medicine, and so every generation builds on something that the previous generation has, and it occurs to me that there's so much discovery. There's everything from microtonality to palindromes to variations on themes. There's so much in terms of composition that previous generations have challenged themselves with, and so it just kind of is logical that you would acknowledge that and try to um, continue in that tradition. It's just I don't know. For me, I can't speak for anyone else, but for me, it's almost like a responsibility. But especially since I hold those composers in such high regard.
Mm-hmm.
I just love them so much that yeah, I kind of, my admiration kind of gives way to maybe advancing the pattern, maybe, if I can put it
So
that way.
someone like Bach wrote palindrome. So the
Yeah.
fact that you did take piano lessons for years, you were able to play Bach and access that music in a different way than just listening.
Yeah, and listening is as much of a complex exercise as performing as well, especially when it comes to Bach. But yeah, things like that. The genius of that guy to come up with inventive mathematical. It's not just Bach. It's Hector Villalobos, or it's Arvo Pärt, or it's John Tavener. It's all of these composers. Mychael Danna, like it's John Williams. It's any one of these really um, admirable composers that there's so much to learn from. Schoenberg, um, Paul Hindemith, all very, very um, astute, knowledgeable composers that develop some great techniques.
How much composition did you study formally?
Formally, almost. Well, I studied with an Estonian composer. Um, his name was Dr. Roman Toi. Um, he was a great composer, and one thing he's known for is choral work. Um, and maybe that's where my admiration for Arvo Pärt comes in, because Arvo Pärt and Dr. Roman Toi were both Estonian composers, and I was introduced to this really rich tradition coming from Estonia and Eastern Europe. I would say Dr. Toi is the one person that helped me understand harmony in a different way. Yeah, and I will say with also working with these other composers, like Lou, for example, was brought up in a jazz tradition. He grew up studying jazz harmony. Um, but I will say all of these different composers, they kind of are all swimming in there. At some point, I give them all credit, because there's not a day that I skip um, invoking some memory of them at some point. So it might not have been extremely formal, but it was kind of I regard it as a la carte education. There's something I realize I don't have. I'll just go grab it.
Do you want to speak to some of your other mentors?
Well, I worked for so many of these people. I worked for Lou Natale in Canada. I worked for um, John Welsman, another amazing, truly amazing composer. I worked a little bit for Glenn Morley to a certain extent. Then in the States, I worked for Mychael Danna, a friend, Robert Duncan, Christopher Young, the great Christopher Young, whose music is so full of detail and nuance and great orchestration. And beyond that, every day, I would say every free day that I get that I'm not writing, I'm studying some composer. If it's not, recently it's been Strauss, but it can be, Bartok. It can be the harmonies of George Gershwin. It could be the melodic or chordal writing of Irving Berlin or Cole Porter. It can be, Gilbert and Sullivan. It just goes. Toru Takemitsu, composers whose names I don't know, but yeah, John Williams, for orchestration. It can be any number of things, but the thing is that all of these things are being used at the same time. It's all in a month's work, I would think. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You had mentioned to me before that in your mesh with your soundscape, you're always hearing a score. It's like there's an internal radio that's different than most people. I think a lot of us have earworms, or we might have something in our mind that we were just listening to or playing. But for you, it's more integral and more realized than that.
Yeah, I don't know what this is. This is maybe I'm crazy. But I don't know what this is. Like I constantly have music going in my head, no matter how loud or softly, but it's always going. So I'll step onto a street or step in the car, and there's always a soundtrack. It's always a soundtrack playing. It's just automatic.
But when you're listening to music, that doesn't drown out the music you're listening to. That'll set that aside.
When I'm listening to music, the music's being. I'm listening to it as individual parts. Mm-hmm. All the orchestration is stretched out, and I'm listening to compression or equalization or mix issues or compositional, analysis, so stuff like that.
Are you able to easily remember chord progressions?
Yeah.
And how about, are you able to take dictation quite easily if you hear a score? Can you write it down?
Yeah.
So that stuff just comes very naturally to you?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Or was that training? I guess that's what I'm getting at.
No, it's a part of this craziness. It's it's part of this affliction. Yeah, I was always able to memorize something. It's kind of like a conversation. You know what I think? I think when it happens from when you're two, it becomes a language maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So when other people, maybe this is it. When you're thinking in a language, you're thinking about what to say. Maybe I have a language going on, and maybe I'm thinking in that language, and it happens to be music. So I don't really have an explanation for it, but maybe it's my emotional language. That's constantly going.
Mm-hmm. And I know you have you've gotten interested in many different styles of music over the years. When I was researching, one thing that came up that I was interested in was Kathakali, because that's a style I wasn't familiar with. So then I was, watching videos of this very interesting dance. And I was curious because also at a certain point you were very interested in opera and musical theater. And as a film and television composer, we're dealing with characters and often certain motives for characters. So how does that relate to those types of music?
Kathakali is a dance that happens, the dance tradition of South India. But the thing is that it's no different. It's no different from acquiring that knowledge in what's happening in kabuki theater, or what's happening in theater in like Central Africa, or the evolution of dell'arte, in Italy, or how theater evolves in the courts in England. I think just kind of like the knowledge of all these different offshoots in history just kind of play into everything else. Like there might be a character that has a certain bent towards any one of these things, and when you identify this character trait, or when you identify a certain nod that a script has to a certain social movement or point in history, it becomes even richer to imbue those scenes with something from that era, or something from that geography. So yeah, just kind of constantly studying the stuff sometimes just comes to your rescue.
Yeah.
So I just keep studying.
Yeah. Well, just in terms of the formulas that would be used in Kathakali to represent certain narrative things or emotions, and I know that opera composers have done the same thing. I guess that's what I was getting at. Just the technique of using music in that way for dramatic purposes.
Yeah, I mean it's the same thing. It's the same thing in ballet as well. It's not that different. The idioms are different, but there's the same principle, and the same thing in that the same techniques in ballet or in Wagner are just replicated in some way in film music. It's just the duplication of or not duplication, but an intelligent way of paralleling emotion or reflecting the subtext. So yeah, it's kind of like the same principles, but maybe updated or done in a different way, but the same principles.
So Colin, do directors and producers give composers a lot of direction in terms of how much scoring they want? If they want, like a John Williams movie tends to have music almost the entire way through, and then some styles are more spare. I guess that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, so and this is where it's all really collaborative.
Mm-hmm.
We really talk about what kind of a movie this is going to be, whether it's going to be, with wall-to-wall, what they call wall-to-wall music, or whether it's going to be spars. This is definitely a conversation that goes two ways. With most directors, I'll definitely listen to everything, and then my ideas are also listened to. We somehow sometimes we agree to lean more to one side or the other. It really depends on project to project. But to answer your question, some movies do deserve treatment where it's more quiet, and others, where it's not so quiet. Even John Williams has some movies where it's not carpeted with music that much, like Born on the 4th of July, and maybe Catch Me If You Can isn't wall to wall music such like Indiana Jones, for example, or Jurassic Park. So yeah, there are variants.
It's not often, but I like, sometimes it's the right feel when there's music that somebody turns on the radio and it's not like a song but it's written for the, you know what I mean, but it's incorporated so that there's a reason why there's music playing.
Yeah.
I like when that technique is used. Do you get decision fatigue in terms of having to make so many decisions every day creatively? Do you get tired of just having... No? Okay.
No, the reason being is because, sometimes on another level, the job is all decision making. It's the art of decision making.
Mm-hmm.
It's the art of standing between the horns of a dilemma and knowing all the different possibilities. Having the most widest, richest spectrum of possibilities, and then analyzing the pros and cons of each one, going with the best one and doing it in a record amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the thing is that each decision, each quandary is very different from the last one. So it's challenging, and that challenge kind of keeps me engaged. So I like decision. Yeah.
So the time flow, is music one of the last things that's added before the final edits?
It depends on the people making the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are starting to involve me a lot earlier now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very welcome. But very often, it's you're sprinting to the project because you're one of the last people.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So are you at liberty to say what your project is right now, or not?
I'm a little superstitious, but
okay, that's fine.
But yeah, no, it's a good. I hope it'll be a nice little project, a nice little documentary. We're figuring out some of the logistical things right now, but yeah, I think it'll be a very spiritually satisfying journey by the end of it. Yeah. Okay.
So are a lot of the projects you're doing sort of fairly long? Like, are you on something for 6 months or?
This one I will be, but it runs the gamut. Some projects need something done in a matter of weeks. Other projects will sometimes need 3 or 4 months, which is really welcome. You get to think things out, So both are just fine.
So I'm curious, you haven't dipped your toe in the podcast music world, which is a whole thing now.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to. I listen to some podcasts almost daily, and it would be great to contribute to them. But the podcast stream or track is completely different. Apparently, you write a whole bunch of things and hope that they get used or something like that. It's not really on a project by project basis. It's more of a library, what they call library basis. So it perplexes me, but yeah, that'd be awesome if I did something for a podcast.
So this Sprite commercial, you had submitted another clip. So that was using a beatboxer. So how did you direct it wasn't done with synthesizer, right? It was a live human beatboxer.
Yeah, really, I found someone in the world of commercials that's even faster than film and TV. You get literally a day maybe to do something like that. And so I found a beatboxer. He lived with his mom on the other side of town. I picked him up and I got in my place, and it was mostly me telling him the rhythm that I had in mind, and I kind of verbalized it for him, and he duplicated it, and he had a bunch of other ideas, and yeah, it kind of came together that way. But yeah, that was an interesting scenario. It was a scenario where I was completely broke and I didn't have any money to do this, and the owner of this jingle house called me and said, "Hey, do you want to take a stab at this?" Many people, there were at least 14 other options, and mine got picked. So yeah, it couldn't have come a moment later, because I really needed the money back then.
One thing we didn't talk about that could be interesting is some of the traditions in the film industry to use guide tracks, where they use a famous symphony or for another. Is that still done quite a bit?
Well, it's done for a number of reasons. The first reason it's done is because when they're editing a movie, they need to understand the flow of the scene. They need, so basically they need rhythm underneath each cut. Without rhythm, it can seem discombobulated. It can seem very uncoordinated. So, and that's not something that audiences are very used to. So when you put a track of music underneath an edit, you suddenly know where to put each cut. But what will happen is that everyone's working on a team, and there's many members of the team that have to look at those cuts. And many people can kind of start to fall in love or create an expectation of what the end result will be, end result meaning with music, that may include very close to that temp track. And so that can create a pressure on the composer, but not necessarily. There are now this idea of this expectation and what they call temp love is now pretty popular, and so I think filmmakers now are more vigilant of that. When I get a film now, I usually don't get a temp track with it, so people, filmmakers now are kind of wise to this pitfall.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, especially when the recording that you use on a temp track, that recording you just don't know the circumstances. Maybe that composer had 4 months to write something, and the new composer doesn't have that time, or maybe they had vastly more money and a big music team of orchestrators, and maybe the composer for your film doesn't really have that luxury. So those parameters have to be kind of acknowledged. The difference, which you won't really know. So yeah, filmmakers these days I think are more attuned to the fact that to treat their composer within the parameters they're operating in.
Mm-hmm. That's more respectful too, right?
More practical, yeah, as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think you've well, had you stayed in Canada, I mean, we still have a pretty robust film industry in Toronto. Do you think you would still have had a lot of opportunities, or was your move to LA really created a lot more opportunities for you?
Both are great. LA just has a lot more happening, as opposed to Canada. And in Canada, there's a lot of what we do is based on government funding. In the States, it's a lot more open-ended. But there's opportunities in everywhere. There's just more opportunities in the States, and it fluctuates as well. The opportunities in the States during the recession go down, and who knows? With policies can change, and we're getting a lot of streaming services now in Canada that are setting up headquarters there. So you really just don't know. It's we're in a state of flux right now.
Mm. What during the first part of the pandemic with the lockdowns, did you have projects canceled? Was there a lot of uncertainty in your business?
Oh yeah. I had projects canceled, and things weren't happening because in order to make a movie, you had to gather in big groups, in big numbers, and in close proximity. So you just could not. You just couldn't make a movie, and there were a number of trials. I remember reading the papers in the trades. There'd be movies attempting to film and not. And someone would get COVID and they'd be shut down again. And if you really look at it, COVID protocols represented another expense on the film production. So they had to spend money there. And each time you shut down and revamp, that's another expense as well. So yeah, I'm glad we're out of it right now, but that was a dark time for sure.
Did you had extra time in your hands? Did you do creative things, or was it just really hard?
Yeah, I did some creative things. I did this one choral piece called "Hymn for Our Times." Mm-hmm. It was using footage of LA that I found, and it was just there's always something to do. The to-do list is a bottomless pit of to-dos.
I listened to Hymn to Our Times. It's really beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
And your father was ill at the time as well when you wrote that?
Yeah, my dad was ill. He was passing away at that time.
Were you able to spend time with him because you were able to be back in Toronto? Or?
Yeah, I went back to Canada and I spent time with him. These part of life, I guess.
Was he happy that you had pursued film composition as a job? He was to a certain extent. I mean, I've Indian parents, so the direction of thought is always towards something where there's a predictable paycheck every 2 weeks or a month mm-hmm. or whatever. But either way, my dad put this trade in my hand more or less, and I think it's my purpose. So it's my vocation. Yeah. Oh, it's a beautiful vocation. Thanks so much for sharing.
So is yours.
Well, thanks so much for sharing your experience today, Colin. It was really interesting.
Thank you, Leah. I'm completely aware that I'm just a small composer in Toronto and LA, and I don't claim to be an expert on anything, but I just know my own experience, and hopefully I relayed those authentically, and that's the bounds of my knowledge, really.
Well, it's an ongoing process, but I mean, you have your voice and I think what you're doing is so magical, to
Thanks.
to convert. I can't even express it in words. I mean, music does it so much better.
Well, thank you so much, Leah. Thank you for the reverence you give composers and musicians and music. I think it comes from you being a professional musician as well. And this is something I think people that generally interview musicians, in the musical arena are missing, because there's this insight into music or the thinking of a composer that a lot of people only kind of look at recreationally and from time to time, but not in depth. So your insight, your approach to it, your understanding of it definitely shows. These questions are always on point. I watch your other interviews as well, and it brings out certain things from the people you're talking to that I don't think other interviews bring out. So I'm very honored to be one of the people you interviewed. So thank you, Leah.
Oh, thanks, Colin. Okay. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Thanks for following the series on your favorite podcast player and sharing your favorite episodes with your friends, all of which help find new listeners. I have lots more episodes coming in this season 3 with a fascinating diversity of musicians and their stories and music. Have a great week.